Hello and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I'm your host, Joel Harrison. As the title suggests, this podcast is a broad remit covering the evolving challenges associated with generating trust and influencing buyers in all areas of B2B. These are perennially tough challenges, but they've taken on a new urgency and resonance in what's a rapidly changing landscape. Episodes are released weekly, so please don't forget to subscribe and to rate or like this episode or the podcast as a whole. So today, my guest is Eddie O'Brien, who's currently Senior Director of Global Customer Insight at Sage, and he's a passionate exponent of the importance of customer insight and research to inform excellent B2B marketing. Moreover, he's got some fascinating views on how this discipline and other related areas such as thought leadership could and should evolve in the era of AI. As part of my ongoing exploration of thought leadership in the AI era, I'm really looking forward to digging into this and understanding how Eddie sees the future and why we mustn't be held back by the conventions of the past. In this session, you'll learn 1, why market research has been cautious to embrace AI and why that needs to change. 2, the opportunity and potential use of agentic AI to speed up the briefing process for thought leadership. And 3, why humans will remain critical with the insight and market research functions despite the rise of AI. So lots to talk about. Eddie, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. What an exciting topic. A lot to get through.
A lot to get through, definitely. So really excited to talk to you about this. So let's start by just positioning Sage, right? Because it's particularly based in the UK. Sage is a very well-known brand, but maybe people don't necessarily know everything that it does or where you position yourself right now. How would you just sum up Sage as an organization?
Yeah, Sage, it's been around for 40 years. It was the original OG of innovation when it came to accounting. Accounting is a sector, is something obviously it's been around for hundreds of years, but it hadn't changed much. It was still a ledger, pen to paper, and whatnot. So Sage actually now is a global company. 40 years later, we're in ERP, we're in HR&P software. We do software for small businesses, accountants, CFOs, chief operating officers. We're actually one of the biggest tech companies in the UK.
So that's you've got a kind of really strong brand, particularly in the UK, and as you say, that heritage really cuts for an awful lot. So yeah, it's great to be able to talk to you about these things.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have all of the global tech companies here, but it's good to have some company like Sage as part of within the UK. So, but you personally, you've been working customer insight for 25 or 30 years. You know, you don't possibly old enough for that to be the case. But you mentioned the kind of the craft of customer insight. You know, in this is bizarre in this changing world, it hasn't actually changed very much for 100 years until about now. So what's happening now? I think we all kind of know what's driving it. What's happening now? And why is this a moment of such a turning point for B2B insight professionals?
Yeah, it's a huge turning point. And to your point around the craft of market research or insight not changing for 100 years, the way that I think about it, I like to chunk things down simply. And I talk about the 3 eras of insight. The first era was when customer insight and research was really born over the US in the early 20th century. You know, presidential elections, people wanted to find out who the president was going to be. So quant research was born. Polling was born, and then you roll on 30 or 40 years later, consumerism accelerates, right? So then you had brand research in the 60s and 70s kick in, focus groups, you know, deep ethnography, all of those types of techniques emerge. And then the third era of research, I suppose, kicking in now with agentic AI. But if I kind of wind back to the second era of research, the big thing that changed in the 2000s was the digital democratization of research. You know, you had all of these platforms like SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics. Everybody had access to be able to do some sort of custom research, and research became quite democratized, Joel. So here we are in this sort of what I call the kind of third era of insight and market research, where insight is no longer just about collecting and interpreting data. With AI, you now have something that can independently think, act. It's autonomous. It can make decisions. So now what we see in our craft and insight is AI's adding huge value to the insight workflows. And what does that mean for B2B? So B2B, in terms of being different to consumer, it has massive implications on my craft. Speed, you know, rather than 6 weeks where you try to recruit CFOs, you know, do research with like boardroom level people in B2B, which takes forever. AI now offers that opportunity to do it really, really quickly. Cost, it's not cheap to do a B2B research. So in a world where you can get synthetic data and do things at scale really quickly, you know, those kind of costs to do research and insight and make sure that your stakeholders are customer informed becomes much more practical. And then the third thing, which is like more important than all of these things, is productivity. The productivity for insight professionals now, Joel, is absolutely going through the roof. It's amazing to see and watch.
So that's a lot going on. I mean, that's an awful lot of opportunities and potential there, and that's really exciting. So yeah, that sets us up really for a great conversation there. Lots to dig into over the course of the conversation. I guess one of the things that when we first started talking about having a conversation, doing a podcast, I mean, you kind of expressed wanting to talk about Agentic, which is, I would think is a fascinating topic because it feels like just when we thought we were getting a bit comfortable with AI, Gen AI, we know what Gen AI is. That Agentic comes along and confuses everybody again. It's just like it's the kind of the intellectual upgrade or the product upgrade. So let's talk about what. You're keen to clarify what this actually means. I mean, you said it's not about little bots. It's about agency, as in freedom, rather than agency as a marketing agency, learning and autonomous systems. Can you unpack that for us? What does AI, agentic AI, actually mean in practice for your work at Sage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like Gen AI definitely was the thing that kicked it off, but let's be really, really honest here. It was a inquiry opportunity where you sort of asked something a question and it generated an answer, right? And it did that 10 times better, 100 times better than Google ever could, and it's getting better. Gen AI is getting better and better, better. And Gen AI sees the interface. The really exciting thing, though, is agentic. And like I said earlier, what agents mean is not these little bots doing things. It's basically, in my mind, agentic is insight with agency to do stuff for you, where, like I say, the agents are collecting data, analysing it, making decisions, surfacing up recommendations in real time, sucking all the data out of your ecosystem from text and speech analytics, NPS data, quant research, pointing it to ingest and scrape things online. So all of a sudden you have this living, breathing agent that's continuously surfacing up insight, so it's much faster, much quicker. So very, very different. And that's, for me, what agentic really, really means. And it's exciting.
And in that world, is it preempting what it is that you need, or is it just doing just kind of as a background given an agreed task, or both?
I think it's by design. So I think, ultimately speaking, this is where Gen AI and agentic walk hand in hand, because there's a bit of confusion, isn't there, in terms of what's AI, what's the difference between Gen AI, agentic AI, and then you're going to have, I guarantee you, post-Christmas, there's going to be another type of AI, superintelligence, whatever it is that comes out, right? Every year you're going to see exponentially new stuff coming in the AI space. So let me just give you a practical example of how how it's changing our day-to-day working behaviours within an insight strategy team. So let me talk about an analogy. And the analogy is like the last 10 yards. So if you're familiar with like American football, you've got 100 yards on the pitch, right? Insight, particularly in the B2B world, has always been about the heavy lifting, the hard work, doing the research, getting the surveys, the operational stuff. And I'll give you two use cases where I think things are changing massively. And this is where Gen AI comes in alongside Agentic. So I'll give you a use case. Imagine a world where you're entering a new vertical. How it used to look is you do a market analysis, you try and understand the TAM, you do a UNA study, a usage and attitude study to understand how people are behaving. All of that stuff took the best part of 3 months, right? It's like Gen AI, and if you've got a good LLM, and you've got that agentic piece, like continually updating your data ecosystem, the interface, the Gen AI interface, we're going to call our little insight agent something that's very personable, but the UI means that for that specific use case, if you are looking at entering into, say, a new industry vertical, you can prompt, you can say, what's the TAM, what are the kind of pain points in the workflows. You can actually get all of that stuff within hours, stuff that used to take you months. It's like you're turning up with a fact base now that may or may not be 100% accurate, but it's getting you to the 90 yards. So the last 10 yards are quality checking, making sure that, you're looking at stuff and it's sensible, the AI's not hallucinating. What you're able to do is take all of that fact base that you're generating. I promise you, but, by doing it, and I run side by side tests now, like practically every couple of weeks to say, is the AI producing stuff that is as good as the stuff that you would generate through traditional market research? It's not perfect, but I tell you what, it's not far off.
And presumably it's a lot faster. And that back to the top. The benefit, it's broadly comparable, but a lot faster and cheaper.
Yeah, and I can't go into any specific bits of detail, obviously for confidentiality reasons, but only this week I took 3 data points in terms of customer experience data points, in terms of overall experience relative to X, Y, and Z, and looked at the workflows within them. The stuff that you get from, have your good solid LLM, we'll come back to that in a second, but the stuff that you get from your kind of AI relative to going off and doing a traditional bit of market research, it's pretty close. But with that comes, you have to get the LLM bit right. You have to get the stuff that's going into the engine. There's this old analogy in research, which is if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So making sure the stuff that you're putting into your LLM in your ecosystem, that's where new skills are developing, in the industry. That's where, you're having to spend a lot of time and investment making sure that the stuff that you're putting into the engine, so you can do the stuff faster, quicker, cheaper, is actually good quality stuff.
And the more good stuff you got in, and the more workflows, the more experiences, the better it's going to get. So it's self-improving. If you keep feeding it good stuff, it keeps getting better.
100%, right? So that's why I think for me, insight strategy teams of the future, and I'll come back to the briefing process, I suppose, which I spoke to you about, when we initially started talking about this podcast, is that if you start putting the effort investment in terms of continually building your asset is that LLM, that kind of repository of insight and data. You continue to build that, refresh it, etc. It's only going to get better and better and better over time.
Okay. So, as I know that we're going to talk about that kind of briefing process shortly. But one of the areas which I have a lot of interest in, and we've kind of, I know you know this, is around thought leadership. It's been a topic I've been exploring an awful lot on, and thought leadership is a very powerful marketing channel, but it often requires quite nuanced marketing positioning and differentiated points of view. What have you got a take on how well AI systems handle that strategic complexity right now, and what are they doing well, and what do they perhaps need to be further developed in order to help with?
The thing that I really feel passionately about is AI is pitched as a thing versus a human. And that's really irritating, because if you ask me, can AI produce some good thought leadership? The answer is simple. It's yes, it can. Thought leadership is not a science. It's an art, right? There's no playbook for thought leadership. Either the stuff you say is interesting or it's not. And with AI, it's no different. So what I tend to do when I'm looking at pieces of work or insight or thought leadership is, I don't see it as an A-B process. It's like, produce me some thought leadership on this topic. What I do is I do some pondering. I go for a walk, have a cup of coffee, and I think about, well, what's my perspectives on this topic? I put it down, and then I test it with the agent, the LLM. I get it to come back and stress test and challenge, and you have a conversation, and you play. It's about playing, isn't it? And so I think I use AI from a thought leadership perspective, and I've got a very clear position on this. AI will never replace the human ingenuity and thought leadership that we do. Never. There's no point being a human being if that is the case, right? We're all doomed. But what it can do is, it's that productivity again. It's that kind of last 10 yards. It's about, using AI to build, challenge, create, co-create. We're going to talk about, hopefully later on in the podcast, AI personas. We're going to talk about synthetic data. It's using all of that stuff to enhance and challenge your perspective and your thoughts. And so the beauty is when you're using AI, in reality, what you're using is 10 million other voices, as well as your own voice on a topic.
Okay. All right. Fascinating stuff. I really like your kind of impassioned defense, and railing against some of the perhaps erroneous statements that are going on out there about it. One of the, as again, all you'll also know is that trust is obviously the title of this podcast, right?
Yeah.
Where you're, integrating, where you're not necessarily replacing humans, but you're integrating AI into the process. Where does human judgment become non-negotiable in the workflow? And I'm going with number 5, right, which is so. Eddie, as you know, trust is central to this podcast. And when AI is drafting, briefed, or analysing data that will inform major business decisions or thought leadership positioning, how do you build that confidence as necessary with the stakeholders? What questions might they ask, and how would you kind of address those in terms of the use of AI and any compromises they might perceive?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And this is where I'm very fortunate to work in a technology industry that is, at the forefront of AI. So it comes down to one simple thing, or if there's a few things, there's a few needs. Can I trust what the output is? Am I in control? Trust and control are the emotional needs wrapped in what we do with AI. So let me be plain and simple around what the use case again is here. In the old world, you did a piece of strategy work or a piece of research, and it produced data based on quantitative methods that have been tried and tested and evolved methodologically for 100 years, right? So you can trust this data. When AI comes into the mix, it's like, well, okay, is AI hallucinating? How is it kind of doing this? And it's about bringing folks on the journey. So AI is still not 100% perfect. There are still weaknesses and gaps, but I can tell you some of the things that the industry is doing and that we're beginning to do to build that trust and confidence. So you'll hear terms like synthetic data. You'll hear terms like AI personas. And what we are doing, and what a lot of the industry is doing, agencies, client-side practitioners, is we're essentially doing monadic testing, A/B testing, where we're testing traditional methods alongside new AI methods that are kind of using synthetic data to do the same study. So let me give you an example. There is a scenario where you can do a piece of quantitative research, deploy a survey or a piece of work amongst real people, traditional old world methods, and you can replicate that process through synthetic respondents and data. Now, there's not a perfect match at the moment, but again, it's pretty close. It's getting pretty close. I see a world where, again, this is my hope, we're all figuring this out. I see a world where you have a blended approach, because the weakness is if you then get the whole industry to pivot towards using synthetic data, that synthetic data is trained on real people and real responses. So over time, if you're not feeding the engine of synthetic data with real people and real responses, it's kind of losing the pulse of reality. So I see a world actually where you have hybrids. You have AI working alongside traditional research, and that's how you're building trust with your stakeholders. You're actually saying to your stakeholders, here is a scatter plot, and that scatter plot shows a big, strong correlation between this AI stuff here and traditional stuff here, and somewhere in the middle is the stuff that gets you that exponential scale, velocity, cost reduction, etc., so that all of us as stakeholders can think about how we create differentiation and competitive advantage in our marketing.
Okay, that's fascinating. That seems like that clarity and transparency all the way seems like the better, a sensible approach, a necessary approach. I mean, on that subject though, in terms of that kind of I think what's underlying all of this is that interface between the AIs. I'm not sure if it's plural or singular.
Yeah.
And the humans. So when you're using AI, do you kind of are the non-negotiables where humans have to be involved? Where's the line saying that the human has to do this bit, the AI can do that bit, but humans have got to do these bits? Are you clear on that?
100%. Very, very clear. So let me say what AI does versus human. And there are two words that I use when it comes to that very point. There's the explicit and the implicit. So when you're working in the world of the explicit, let me say what I mean by that. when you look at a big, juicy, fat LLM, it's working on an ecosystem of data, which is either conversations or behavioral data that's being explicitly expressed by humans by either saying some stuff or doing some stuff, right? That's explicit. Where the human ingenuity kicks in is in the sphere of the implicit, the things that are not said. So if you look at marketing in B2B, the rich insights can be found in that space of the unsaid, the emotional aspects of human beings, the things they will never ever say on a survey, on an online forum board, uh, even how they behave, sometimes, sort of clicking on some buttons, etc. So I'll give you a real practical example of what that means, Joel. I think from a creative point of view, I use the window cleaner analogy a lot. A window cleaner doesn't go into business because they want to be, a CEO, millionaire, right? They love getting out in the fresh air. They love plugging your earphones in. Money is probably at the back of their mind. So I've gotten to talk to like sole traders or tradesmen or window cleaners that come to my house on a regular basis. I use it as an opportunity to do a bit of research. And I've had a few fascinating conversations around. It's really curious. Like you've cleaned my windows for 10 years. Like you always miss like asking me for money and payments. It's like sometimes you forget you've not put my prices up for like God knows how long. I'm still paying £10 for you to clean my whole house, and it's like, what's going on there? It's like usually you find like a lot of these small businesses, their wives doing their accounts or a bookkeeper or whatever. And when you get underneath the skin of why are you not driving harder the commercials of your business, there's like real core insights that you unearth around things like, I'm afraid to ask for money. It makes me really uncomfortable. It gives me anxiety. I don't like talking about money. It's like, I don't like talking to people, quite frankly. And so you won't find a lot of those insights on a forum board or, a survey because you have this say-do gap. Call it the say-do gap. Behavioral science, you probably are very familiar with all of these topics, right? What people say and what they do are two very different things. So I'll go back to the point I made at the beginning, which is AI is brilliant for the explicit and all of that stuff is gold dust. But where the strategists come in and where you can create competitive advantage and distinction for brands is where the implicit happens, really getting into the emotional needs of customers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great. And it's a great analogy to explain the point, and a way is a very human analogy, which is very appropriate for what we're talking about right now. So one of the topics I really want to talk to, because it's such a fascinating area, and we've prepped with loads of area questions, but I'm actually going to have to rationalise this a little bit, given the nature of the conversation. One of the things I really want to talk to you about, I know which were the starting points of our conversation, was around AI in the briefing process. There's often brief writing is a very complex part of any form of B2B marketing, thought leadership in particular. What do you think? What are the opportunities and possibilities for AI in this area, and how do you begin that process of adopting them?
I think briefing, getting a good brief, is probably the most important thing in a marketing and insight workflow, right? Whether it's a brief for a piece of market research, whether it's a brief for a piece of creative work, whether it's a brief for a business strategy, I think good work lives or dies based on the quality of the brief. And one of the frustrations or pain points is when you're doing briefs, right, is a lot of briefing processes almost like start from scratch. So, and it's like, well, okay, we've got a problem to solve here. We want to do X, Y, and Z in X category, and we want to sell more stuff, right? We need to find out X, Y, and Z. I think what the briefing process does now, fueled with AI, is, you've got this wealth and repository of insight and knowledge that you can draw upon. And so, again, going back to the point around being efficient and productive, and that whole, getting the 90 yards, so getting the last sort of 10 yards of making the brief really sharp and really brilliant, is that you can actually take the core concept of a brief, the questions that are in a brief, put it through your AI model and actually work with your AI to drop on all the brilliant insight you've already got that's in the organization, that's external, and say, right, really kind of push this brief. Tell us who the ICPs are, who are the targets, what are their unmet needs. Tell us what the problems are in relation to these business questions. And, what I find is that in the briefing process now, it's not quite autonomous, but it could get to an autonomous point in the future, a dystopian future, 10, 20 years in the future, where brief writing becomes a little bit more autonomous with some human intervention. It's bringing stakeholders together. You're not starting from scratch. In the insight world, it is entirely possible that you have an insight agent that your stakeholders are working with to generate a brief. They put in a request to say, we want to do a piece of research, we want to do a piece of work. Okay, start filling in this brief online. The agent will go on and draw on all the insight that already exists that you have to surface up. Here's all the insight we have. Are you sure you need to do a piece of research? Point one, yes. And you start to play with your stakeholders through the agentic process. There's a world as well, which you the agent could take that brief, finish it off with stakeholders, a bit of human intervention where people are getting involved, and then it pings off to an insight agency or a strategy agency, not the person, but the insight agency or the strategy agency's agent. And then it's sort of creating the response so that, the agent at the agency side gets the brief, works up some solutions, and then goes to the account director or whoever it might be and say, right, we've had this brief, here are some potential responses we could look at. What do you think? And then boom, straight into the creative process. So you're cutting out and making the whole process much more productive. Now, hopefully I've not explained a kind of crazy, dystopian world, but it's about productivity and taking all the stuff out of the equation that is the heavy lifting, going over old ground, the back and forths between people. It's not about replacing human beings. It's about making the creative process, whether that's in research, insight, strategy, creative development, much more productive than it is today.
So that's fascinating. And again, you're very pain to stress that this is not like the robots take over the world. This is about efficiency. But just can we just unpack some of the reasons why it's so slow and laborious at the moment, right? Because forgive me, right? I'm not, I'm a journalist background. I'm not when I worked in a marketing team, I worked alongside marketing teams, and I've not been worked in the market research function, for example. So you talked about one of the things that clearly is going to be taking time is stakeholders, right? So is that in terms of us working out what we actually want to do in the first place, right? There's the kind of the business objective definition, which then feeds into the brief. Am I right there? And is that what is one of the major kind of drains in time?
Yeah, I think one of the major drains in time is getting people aligned properly around the problem. So, a poor brief is like, we want to do a piece of research and we want to investigate these types of people. Why? What research have we got? And a lot of time, I think I use this sort of dumbbell analogy, is that most of the work happens here at the front end and in the back end. And, doing the research and executing the process is the easy part, if I'm being honest with you. But like I said earlier, you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So I think for me, what AI does is it speeds up that upfront part a lot. Whether that's like an agent doing it or whether you're using AI to sort of help. What it really does is it brings stakeholders together around the big questions, the big problems. It stress tests the insight you've got. Quite often organizations suffer from this kind of knowledge management problem where you're recycling and answering the same questions again and again. People come, people go. And all of that wealth of knowledge, that knowledge drain happens on a continual basis. And I think what Agentic and what AI does, and having good solid, whether you call them LLMs or insight ecosystems, whatever you want to call them, I think AI is transformational, for knowledge management. And good briefs rely on having really, really good foundational knowledge. And that's where the value can be created.
And I guess I completely buy into that. And I see that in myself, right? Sometimes I've always I'm quite good at sucking up knowledge about what's going on in B2B marketing, but I'm a human and I forget things. And often my opinion about stuff is subjectively based on the last conversation I've had or someone I spoke to over here or what I had for breakfast that day. Whereas so I guess it can be not necessarily comprehensive, but at least it can be much more thorough than what any human can contain. And crucially, it's not subjective; it's more objective in terms of how it brings stuff to the surface. Is that correct? Would you agree with that?
Human beings, and includes, so I'll say what my inherent weaknesses are, but these inherent weaknesses are true for all human beings. And it's like, again, it goes back to behavioral science. Human beings have a huge amount of bias. And when you go through a particular topic, there may be a problem with sales or whatever it is. And then what kind of happens is a few things. Saliency effect, where the most, or recency effect, right? Which is that the thing of the day dominates the conversation. Inherent behavioral biases, confirmation bias, what your stakeholders might have around an idea, for example, all of these biases creep in when you're, creating work. And ultimately the reason that knowledge management is really important, where AI comes in, is it really, really stress tests us to make sure that are we really foundationally acting upon the insight, the reality of the insight of this situation that we find ourselves in today. Are we really acting upon, the outside world? Are we acting on our own behavioral biases, etc.? So human bias, as well as like the thing that makes us different, unique, and our ability to be creative and create differentiation in brands, is also the thing that holds us back. I don't know what it's like in some of the organisations you've worked in, Joel, but quite often in organisations, it can be like a little bit like watching a pub football team sometimes, or, a bunch of people running around when a hot topic comes up, all of a sudden everybody's swirling around that hot topic. And I think it's a real good strategy function or an insight function. It's your job to really bring the voice of the customer, the market, the realities of the insights that you've had already. Make sure that the business is grounded in that foundational knowledge of the reality of where we are today. And then we can all be on the same baseline.
Absolutely. I love that. Beautifully expressed. And I guess that, am I right in thinking that if you've got this knowledge management centralized repository of data, which you can access and call upon, sometimes the business perceives it as an insight need. It might not require any more market research to address that need. It might have all that within the system already. So in that respect, is that accurate? Is that possible?
Yeah. So I'll give you a great example of this. And again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, for confidentiality reasons, but we were looking at a new category, a new market, etc. And it's like, well, we want to do a bunch of research to really understand the customer. Enter AI, enter the system we have. It's like, well, let's really stress test the hell of what we've got first. And then, all of a sudden we're like, well, these are the top 10 workflows. These are the pain points in the workflows. This is how we compare in these workflows to other competitors, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a kind of baseline foundation level of knowledge. These are our assumptions, but you know what? There are still some unanswered questions. What it does is it gets you to, again, going back to that point, which is it gets you to a certain point where you're all baselined on the reality. You understand the sharp questions, the important questions you need to focus on. Because I think when you're looking at briefing and you're looking at marketing or creative strategy or research or whatever it is, you spend a lot of time on a big bunch of questions that are a waste of time that you already know the answers to. And so I think what leads to good work, good creative work, are the sharp questions that are going to make a difference. It's all about the questions, right? And so if you can get through all of that other guff, all of those other questions, those things that are foundational knowledge, that can stop you wasting a lot of time, getting to a good solid, fact base, a good baseline of knowledge, you can focus on the big questions that really matter, that are going to make the difference.
And then thinking specifically about thought leadership, does that differ very much for any other kind of marketing activity or initiative or brief, or should, because thought leadership has a particular set of prerequisites, doesn't it? Are there things that you, and I've not expressed that very well. It's an unplanned question.
Sorry.
Let me try that one again. If you're briefing thought leadership, if you think you've got a thought leadership need, is that any different for any other form of marketing campaign that you might be planning, like a lead gen campaign or a brand campaign? Is this a similar process, or is it distinct in some ways?
So I can talk with authority on the area of domain of expertise, which is mine, which is the craft of insight. But I work very closely with B2B marketers,
Mhm.
and I can tell you their world is transforming with AI in terms of bringing Agentic into the mix. If you think about the whole world of performance marketing, right? That's such a ripe territory for agentic AI. Being able to look for signals, being able to, craft living, breathing personas, being able to sort of target messages. I won't go into that in detail, but in terms of like, again, it comes back to it's the operational efficiency with some creativity. But what I suppose the AI can't do is give you that uniqueness, that newness, that freshness of messaging, because you've heard it before, ultimately speaking, the danger is you get to rest the bottom an echo chamber of sameness or AI slot, whatever it might be. But let me tell you something about AI. I read a research report and in the context of marketing, right? And B2B marketing as well. There's this kind of notion that AI is not as good as essentially producing creative as human beings. And the latest research that I've read actually is when you look at effectiveness, some of the stuff that AI is creating now is as effective. It's like, I think Kantar or whoever did the research. Uh, you know, at the top end, in terms of some of the best creative assets, some of the best creative assets are as effective, or if not more effective, than the human generated creative content itself. So that's actually, not a question of, hey, in 5 years, AI will be able to produce B2B marketing assets that are as effective as human-led stuff. That's nonsense. It's doing it today, and people don't mind. People, this kind of notion of AI slop is completely overrated. But I tell you where the real unique point is, for me, the point where brands can carve out differentiation. All of that money will save on the creative production process. I think there's a little bit of tiredness around from consumers or human beings being in the digital world through traditional marketing channels. Marketing has never been so good. Right, this notion of like advertising wasn't as great as it was 60 years ago is an utter nonsense. The dopamine levels that you see through people connecting with content is through the roof. It's never been as strong. People need a break from that. If brands want to create differentiation, as much as I love AI, I think one of the next big bets for marketing is experiential. What will brands do offline? So I don't know if that
I,
answers your question, but it takes us down like a completely different route in terms of what AI does do, really, really well, but actually where is the space for humanity in
I
all of
completely
this?
agree with that, and I think we're already seeing that in terms of the amount of investments going into a physical, real world marketing. This just this year, it's extraordinary. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I completely agree with that. Eddie, this is fascinating conversation with so many directions we can go in. I wanted to leave with one last question, which is you've kind of painted a vision of the future that we might be heading towards, that you're certainly feels like you're striving towards. If we fast forwarded 2 years, what percentage of AI insight work do you think will be AI augmented? Will it be all of it, or is everything going to be AI augmented?
I think ingredients, so all of it to a greater or lesser degree, will be either, again, it's not binary, right? So you'll do a traditional piece of research, but AI it's a method, it's a part of the process. So AI will be inherently like, it's almost like saying, Joel, how much will computers be involved in, the work that you do? It's like everything to a greater or lesser extent, right? AI is part of that. AI is like a bit of software, whatever it might be. There'll be some stuff that it does which is completely autonomous. Like I say, if you have an engine, it's drawing upon product insights, market insights, brand health. All of that stuff should be delivered, 90% autonomously in the future. In terms of creative work, it's that synergy between, the implicit and the explicit between human beings and AI. So, it's already having a massive impact. The debates around AI having a role in insight marketing, those are gone. Like those are completely gone. It's here. We're using it. you've got to get on board, right? If you're not using AI to supercharge what you're doing, then you've got to get left behind 100%.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fascinating. It's just one of those areas where there's just understanding the nuance in that particular aspect. And it excites me because I think insight is something which marketers have often skipped. They haven't spent as much time as they should have done on it. So the idea of being able to do it better, faster and cheaper, or at least as well, is really exciting. So Eddie, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. I think your insights and perspective are really fascinating. So thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this.
A real pleasure. Thank you. Always good to have a chat, Joel. Thank you so much.
Great stuff. Well, thanks. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If there's anything, if you have, I hope you'd take time to subscribe, but also to like and share this podcast. We really appreciate you sharing the message about what we're trying to talk about here and the importance of trust in B2B in all its different implications. So there's loads more content like this throughout this podcast. So please tune in and listen to more. But in the meantime, for now, thanks for listening and goodbye.